Everyone, and welcome to Council Chambers. I'm going to call this hearing of the Rules and Reference Committee to order. We're here this evening to discuss 4 ordinances designed to close the gap between state and federal weapons laws, to protect all victims of domestic violence, and to keep dangerous weapons out of neighborhoods. This has been a collaborative process between City Council, the City Attorney's Office, City Attorney Zach Klein, and Mayor Ginther. At this point, I'd like to, and we're excited to welcome back to City Council Chambers, Mayor Ginther to offer a few words on this important legislation. Mayor Ginther.
Thank you, President Hardin, and to all the members of Council. Thank you for hosting tonight's hearing and for all of your great partnership along with City Attorney Klein and all of our partners in the community, from Choices, staff with the Department of Public Safety, and many of the attendees that are here this evening. I don't want to just rattle off statistics this evening, but here are some numbers that you should know, ones that I cannot get out of my head. 117 of last year's homicides were committed with a firearm. 102 of the victims were between the ages of 18 and 40. 10 of them were known cases of domestic violence. This year in 2018, we are seeing the same. Of the 31 homicides to date, 23 were committed with a firearm. We cannot lose sight of the fact that each of these victims was not a number, but a son or daughter, a mother or father, a neighbor, and a friend, and left behind are empty chairs at the dinner table every single night. In December of last year, a teenager was killed on the west side by a barrage of bullets shot into an SUV. I mentor at West High School every Tuesday, and that Tuesday in particular saw the impact of his death on his classmates when we were there. The students were solemn and subdued, grieving their loss. I frequently think about Severin Claiborne, too. Mr. Claiborne was asleep on his couch when the gunfight started. He was struck and killed by a stray bullet. A few weeks ago, I attended a community remembrance vigil for families who lost loved ones to violence in 2017. It's pretty powerful and a deeply moving reminder of the real loss these families endure long after the news headlines fade. We as a city are committed to reducing violence in our neighborhoods with a strategy that approaches the problems on all fronts in a comprehensive way. Yes, we are hiring more police officers. Yes, we are expanding bike patrols in vulnerable neighborhoods. Yes, we're engaging the community in the prevention and solving of crimes, but we are also proposing common sense regulations with bipartisan support across this community, this state, and this country to reduce gun violence. Local action to close the gap between state and federal weapons laws, to protect all victims of domestic violence, and to keep dangerous weapons out of our neighborhoods and out of the hands of violent criminals who threaten to harm families and children in our city. The key to reducing gun violence is constant efforts to limit access by people who are most likely to misuse them. If this new proposed legislation is passed by Council, we will clear up unnecessary confusion between federal and state weapons laws to protect our families and our first responders. We will take action to protect all victims of domestic violence and assault by including intimate partner violence. We will add violent felonies to the nuisance code, as well as ban the sale of firearms in residential areas. State and federal action is still necessary and still needed to ban assault weapons and implement universal background checks, things that we all support and have common sense bipartisan support. But today, with this proposal, we're taking an important first step on acting now what we can control and do as a city. I'm grateful to the council and guidance of City Attorney Klein and Council President for their leadership and work on this effort, and appreciate all of your commitment for common sense regulations to reduce gun violence and make Columbus safer for our families and children. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mayor Ginther. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your leadership on this effort, and thank you for your passion and your partnership in keeping Columbus safe. Thank you. I would also like to thank my colleagues on council, Councilmember Mitch Brown, Councilmember Emmanuel Remy, Councilmember Jiza Page, and President Pro Tem Stenziano for their partnership and for being here this evening. Councilmembers Elizabeth Brown and Councilmember Tyson were not able to attend this hearing, but their engagement in this conversation has been very, very helpful. At this point, I'd like to provide an overview of tonight's agenda. If you do not have an agenda and you would like one, they are located on the table near the door to the chambers. First, we'll hear from City Attorney Zach Klein and the city employee with the coolest title, Columbus Solicitor General, Laura Baker Morrish. They will provide an overview of Ohio's home rule and go through the specifics of this legislation. They do have a PowerPoint, and hard copies of that PowerPoint are available on the table by the door as well. Second, we'll hear from Dr. David Kessick, Medical Director from Columbus Division of Fire, who will speak on gun violence trauma. We will hear from Deputy Director of Safety, Kate Pashotti, regarding the violent crime statistics from the recent years. Followed by Health Commissioner Maishika Roberts, who will discuss gun violence as a public health issue and what the Health Department is doing to treat gun violence in our community. That will be followed by the Executive Director of Choices for Victims of Domestic Violence, Ms. Sue Valillo, who will provide testimony on this legislation. Finally, we'll get to the most important part of this evening, the public testimony. I have several speaker slips already, but if you would like to fill one out, we will have staff available to pass out speaker slips. Each speaker from the public will have up to 3 minutes to speak. Before I turn the microphone over to City Attorney, I want to make a few points as well. First, I expect there will be additional hearings. We're discussing 4 pieces of legislation tonight that spans from nuisance abatements to imitation guns. That's a wide range to cover. I've asked my colleagues to feel free to hold hearings to discuss particular aspects of this legislation that overlaps with their committees. From what we hear tonight and in future hearings, I expect that we will make changes. And be engaged as we move forward on this legislation. Second, we're here to listen to the public. This legislation came about because we listened and heard the stories from mothers and fathers were telling us and telling our police officers and our community members. Too many of our young people, particularly young people of color, were dying and are dying at gunpoint. Last year, and the mayor mentioned this, on 2 separate occasions, stray bullets entered the same South Linden home. Those bullets wounded 2 young boys, and that is unacceptable. We're speaking today in the shadow of not these neighborhoods, but innumerable mass shootings that have claimed the lives of Americans young and old. This is a community conversation. This is a set of legislation that we as a community believe is important. And like the mayor said, this is a part of us all working together. Thank you again, Mayor, and thank you, City Attorney, and thank you to my colleagues. With that, I will turn the hearing over to our City Attorney, Zach Klein.
Thank you, President Hardin, members of council, and Mayor Ginther. It's an honor to be here tonight to speak about the proposed legislation dealing with the regulation of firearms and violent criminal activity in our neighborhoods. I think I want to begin with just a 100,000-foot view before Ms. Baker-Morrish gets into the details of the legislation that's being proposed of how we got here today. The council president mentioned the backdrop of the national conversation of firearms and the regulation of firearms as a country with high-profile mass shootings. Certainly here in our own community, the record number of homicides in 2017, felonious assaults using a weapon that occur in our neighborhoods at all too often basis. The city of Columbus actually has a history of trying to regulate firearms, somewhat unsuccessfully. There were 2 assault weapons bans that were passed back in the day, and federal appellate court has overturned those back about 10 to 12 years ago. And then more recently, the 3rd assault weapons attempt was actually overturned and preempted by the Ohio Revised Code and the state legislature, a move that was done that's known as Ohio Revised Code 9.68. Ohio Revised Code 9.68 sets out the limitations of which a municipality may regulate firearms. And it is actually a very comprehensive list of things a municipality cannot do as it relates to firearms. The Ohio Supreme Court has upheld 9.68. So it's within the confines of Ohio Revised Code 9.68 that the city of Columbus can act. Now, when I became the city attorney and talking with the mayor and the council president, I challenged my staff to figure out where the exceptions and loopholes are of how we can make a difference in our community as it relates to the regulation of firearms and getting guns out of the hands of individuals who have violent and criminal histories. What can we do to make our community safer? How can we do our part? And my staff, as expected, because they're a bunch of really brilliant and talented lawyers, we believe found those exceptions. And it really lies in part under Ohio Revised Code 9.68 that states that an individual right to keep and bear arms being a fundamental individual right that predates the United States Constitution, the Ohio Constitution, goes on to say that except as otherwise provided by Ohio law and federal law, cities cannot do X, Y, Z. It's within that exception of Ohio law and federal law that we find ourselves here tonight in the belief that what we're proposing follows within the confines of 9.68 and that should it ever be challenged will be upheld by the Ohio Supreme Court because we're operating within those exceptions. We did an intentional, narrowly tailored focus to make sure that we are focusing on individuals who have violent criminal histories, who have dangerous criminal conduct and their possession of a weapon. I want to kind of talk about 3 at least, and we'll get to the testimony and certainly try to answer more questions, but 3 common questions that I've seen since we held our press conference announcing our ordinances, our proposed ordinances, and just try to correct the record before we get into the details of the proposal. The first is, this is just another attempt and the city is going to take our guns. The only individuals that have to worry about guns being taken out of their possession are those that have a criminal history of violent and dangerous conduct that are subject to a protection order, If you do not fall within those categories, no one is trying to take your gun. I grew up in Appalachia and Belpre, Ohio, have the utmost respect for Second Amendment rights, and there is commonality of what we are trying to do on both sides of the gun debate in our attempt in the city of Columbus to narrowly focus how we're getting the hands out of guns of criminals, not law-abiding citizens. The second is just enforce the laws in the books. That's actually somewhat of a true statement. The reality is there are federal laws on the books that deal with a weapons disability charge for those who do have a conviction of domestic violence that are a subject of a protection order. But the simple reality is those laws are not enforced by the Department of Justice. There are a variety of reasons why that is so, the least of which is staffing and going after all of the gun charges that would have to be brought in order to enforce the laws. So, in essence, we are essentially copying and pasting the federal limitations for gun disabilities to the Columbus City Code so that we can enforce the laws on the books. The third is, I'm concerned that I could be a victim of a felony offense of violence on my own property, and the city will shut me down as a nuisance. There's no concern here. The reality is the Ohio Supreme Court has been very clear that only if the owner participated or negligently or knowingly acquiesced to that violent felony offense of violence can the city shut the property down. So unless the owner was involved in or should have known better, then there's no way that the city would have the authority to do that. So we're certainly cognizant of those three major themes that have permeated since the announcement of our proposed legislation. We look forward to the commentary and the discussion that's going to take place with the community, and I'm hopeful that we can find common ground on both sides of the gun debate to move our community forward, to make a difference, and to protect Second Amendment rights, but at the same time, keep our community safer and get the guns out of the hands of criminals who have no business possessing them or owning them. At this time, Council President, I'd like to turn it over to the Solicitor General, Laura Baker Morrish, for a PowerPoint presentation of the details of the proposals. Thank you.
Thank you, City Attorney Klein. Thank you, Council President Hardin and council members for allowing me to speak here today. I know how exciting it is to get to sit through a PowerPoint presentation. It is my intention to make sure, though, that everyone in the room has at least an idea, a better idea of the specific legislation that's being proposed so that we can have conversations about whether it fits, where it doesn't fit, and where we need to go with it from here. As City Attorney Klein mentioned, we were very careful in tailoring our proposed legislations to fit within the gap allowed to us by ORC 9.68, and that is up on the first PowerPoint slide up there. The specific gap that we are looking to be able to fill is the exception for provisions that are either an existing state law or an existing federal law, to see if we can act within the space where there might be a gap between those two. The second area where there is a gap in 9.68 is that 9.68 specifically speaks to the regulation of firearms, components, and its ammunition. What it doesn't specifically discuss are firearm accessories, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the presentation. There are some overarching themes to the proposals that are going to be reviewed here this evening. There are 4 ordinances that encompass the legislative changes that we are proposing, but they fall within these areas of focus. As we originally announced back at the press conference a few weeks ago, there are 11 specific areas we are targeting. 10 of them are being discussed here tonight. The 11th involves a zoning provision that would address the ability to engage in commercial sales in an area zoned residential. That particular piece of legislation is not yet before Council. It's my understanding that's still being worked on, but that's why you're seeing 10 areas of focus rather than the 11 that was discussed previously. The areas of focus specifically: 1, increasing the penalties for the commission of offenses of violence when the offender has access to or possesses a weapon at the time of the commission of the offense. 2, enacting city domestic violence and violation of a protection order ordinances, which would also cover all intimate partner relationships in addition to just family or household members. 3, enacting forfeiture provisions as permitted by state law to allow for forfeiture of firearms when they're used in the commission of an offense of violence or weapons violation, and I'll discuss that a little bit further as we get to that provision. 4, mirroring the state law firearms surrender statute and requiring that weapons seized in connection with domestic violence or protection orders will be held until the order expires. 5, enacting city code weapons ordinances which mirror state law, except that's 6. Filling the gap, 7, between existing federal prohibitions and state law regarding weapons possession. 8, prohibiting possession of firearms accessories, such as bump stocks, although there are others. 9, regulate the possession and display of imitation firearms. And 10, amending the City Nuisance Abatement Code to allow the city to seek to close down properties where felony offenses of violence occur. So specifically, there are 4 ordinances. The first one is 1115-2018, and this deals collectively with the offense of violence violations. First thing, increasing the penalty for possessing a firearm. The specific language that we are proposing is to add, if at the time of the commission of the offense, the offender had a firearm or dangerous ordinance on or about the offender's person or under the offender's control, a violation of this section is a misdemeanor punishable by up to 1 year in jail with a mandatory minimum jail term of at least 180 consecutive days, during which mandatory jail term the defendant shall not be eligible for community control, probation, house arrest, or work release, and up to a $1,500 fine. We specifically proposed adding this provision to the existing city codes dealing with assault, aggravated menacing, and menacing, although for menacing it would increase to an M2 since the existing menacing is a misdemeanor of the 4th degree, whereas the other 2 violations are currently misdemeanors of the 1st degree. Second, the addition of a forfeiture provision, and I wanted to explain this one a little bit further as well. It says, any instrumentality that has been used in a violation for this section shall be seized and is subject to forfeiture pursuant to Chapter 2981 of the Ohio Revised Code, which I recognize is pure legalese. What that means is there is a provision of the Ohio Revised Code that will allow for the forfeiture of what's called an instrumentality. An instrumentality is an item that or device, and there's a specific list of things that can be an instrumentality, of which firearms is one, that is used in the commission of the offense itself. In order to seek forfeiture, it's not enough to just say, hey, he used a gun and I'm taking his gun. There's in fact a provision that would have to be followed. First of all, to be lawful, the forfeiture must actually be alleged in the complaint itself that charges the offense. So an officer who's charging a violation or a prosecutor who's preparing a complaint must state in the complaint itself at the time when they file the charge the following things. They must state first the nature and the extent of the alleged offender's interest in the property. They must describe the property, and they must allege the use of the intended use of the firearm or the property in the commission or facilitation of the offense. If those things are not included in the complaint, it is subject to being amended, but they must be included in order to go forward with a request for forfeiture. Second, in order to seek that a weapon be forfeited as a result of being used in the commission of an offense, you'd not only have to include it in the complaint, you'd also have to convict them of the offense they were charged with. And third, even if you had done both of those things, it is subject to hearing. The prosecutor would have to prove by clear and convincing evidence that it was in fact used in the commission of the offense, and then the judge would have to make a determination as to whether or not we had proven our case. Only after all of those steps had been gone through could anything be forfeited pursuant to the code, which means that simply because we're adding it to the ordinance doesn't mean that it will always result in forfeiture of a weapon or any other instrumentality that's used in the commission of the offense. We have included such a forfeiture provision in the offenses of violence sections to the following specific existing city codes, and that's negligent homicide, negligent assault, aggravated menacing, and menacing. Each of these offenses with negligent homicide and negligent assault are specifically committed either with a firearm or a dangerous ordinance, and aggravated menacing and menacing are often committed with a firearm. Next, we've enacted or proposed enacting a City Code domestic violence and violation of a protection order. The City Code domestic violence statute would in all ways, to begin with, mirror the state code. So the existing state code domestic violence and its definitions for what a family or household member would be, the penalty provisions, the beginning of the ordinance would mirror that. However, we've added to it. We would add protections for intimate partners. So there would be specific violations that would be possible for individuals who are involved, who are an intimate partner, and then we went on to define what an intimate partner is. That would be a person for whom the offender is or has been in a dating relationship, but who does not meet the definition of a family or household member, such as would constitute domestic violence. Dating relationship means a relationship between individuals who have or have had a relationship of a romantic or intimate nature, and dating relationship does not include a casual acquaintanceship or ordinary fraternization in a business or social context. I wish I could say I wrote that, but I didn't. It came from the Ohio Revised Code, and it came from House Bill 1. So once again, we are adopting and mirroring the state law in terms of what their definition is for a dating relationship and including it in the city code. Added to the domestic violence provision, we are recommending that we also allow for the increased penalty for violating this provision if a firearm was possessed at the time of the violation. We're recommending that a forfeiture provision be added. Once again, that would only be applicable if an item that is subject to forfeiture was used to commit the violation. And then finally, as I said, we included the actual definitions that I just referenced earlier. For a violation of a protection order, once again, the violation language mirrors state law. Under the state laws, with the passage of House Bill 1, dating relationship protection orders are now covered under state law, and the city code would then also cover that in its violation of a protection order provision. But what we add to the state law is once again the increased penalty for violating it if you possessed a firearm at the time, which unfortunately is a common occurrence in municipal court. And secondly, it adds a forfeiture provision, once again, if we were able to prove that it was an instrumentality. So that is Ordinance 1115-2018. And I had intended to go through these, and then obviously I'm open to questions at any time. I don't know if your preference is that I continue or if I stop here. Okay. Thank you, Council President. 1116-2018 are the gun ordinances. These are the ones specifically addressing gun possession and the manner in which they are possessed or used within the city. The first thing that we did as a general group is to reenact gun ordinances that had previously existed in the city code. In each one of these instances, the language of the prohibition itself mirrors that existing under state law. That would include a definitions provision, using weapons while intoxicated, defacing identification marks of a firearm, underage purchase of a firearm, immunity from prosecution, and possessing criminal tools. The language here mirrors state code. The additions to the city code, and the reason why we might be enacting a city code, are to add the forfeiture provisions to the ones that constitute violations, and that would be the weapons while intoxicated, the defacing, the underage purchase, and the possessing criminal tools. Once again, that could only actually occur if the prosecution went through all the 3 steps I delineated earlier in order to seek forfeiture of the weapon. Next, I'm sorry. Addition of a forfeiture provision. So the reason that this is different, these are existing city codes where we're just adding the forfeiture provision as contrasted with the other slide, which were ordinances where we're reenacting city ordinances that mirror state law. So these already exist. We want to add the forfeiture provision. Those are failure to secure a dangerous ordinance, unlawful transaction in weapons, which also includes a failure to report loss, and discharging of weapons. These are existing city codes. Filling the gap. A lot has been discussed about filling the gap, and probably this violation, more than anything else that we're proposing here this evening, is the one that speaks directly to the heart of filling the gap between state law and federal provisions. Under state law, there is a state weapons under disability crime. It encompasses a variety of individuals who are federally disqualified from owning or possessing a firearm, who then come to be in possession of a firearm. And if they do so, they violate state law. It's a felony of the 3rd degree. Under the federal law, there are numerous other individuals who fall into categories that disallow them from owning or possessing a firearm. But the 2 laws don't match up. So while everything under the state law is also within the federal law, there are many categories within federal law that are not currently a violation of state law. The difficulty then is if a Columbus police officer encounters an individual who they know to be federally disqualified from possessing a firearm and who they see in the possession of a firearm, they currently can't do anything unless they've committed another crime. They would have to contact federal authorities and see if they want to pursue the action. By filling that gap, it would give our law enforcement officers an opportunity to see whether or not that individual needs to have the weapon taken from them at that point, and we can decide whether or not we can file misdemeanor weapons under disability charges. I will note at this point that the General Assembly has since introduced legislation. It's just been introduced into a Senate committee, and I'm blanking on the name right now, but it has not yet had a hearing. And that legislation is Legislation 288, as to be distinguished from 228. And Senate Bill 288 would propose doing what we are suggesting doing here today. Specifically with weapons under disability, the language, the enabling language, unless relief from disability, et cetera, comes from state law. What we are adding to that are the specific prohibitions that are included in federal law that are not currently under state law. That would be those who are currently under indictment for or convicted of an additional laundry list of felony violations that are at the fourth degree, felony or higher. And there's a specific list of them. They generally include things along the lines of promoting prostitution. There are some weapons violations. There are a number of felony offenses that are F4 or higher that are not contained within state law that we would add here. It adds that those currently subject to a court order of protection would be able to be prosecuted under city law, just as they would be under federal law. It adds that those convicted of misdemeanor domestic violence, once again prohibited under federal law, would be subject to city law prosecution. It includes a forfeiture provision, and it includes the mandatory jail time. Under the federal law, and federal sentencing guidelines are incredibly complicated, but a weapons under disability violation under the federal law can be as much as 10 years in a federal prison. Under state law, it's a third degree felony. The most we can do is a misdemeanor of the first degree, but at least we can close the gap. Firearm surrender. This provision mirrors state law in most ways and enacts provisions which mirror the state law regarding the surrendering of firearms. It basically provides a process by which that would occur and by which those firearms would be returned to an individual should they ask for it to be returned after having had it seized or having surrendered it. It does, however, add a provision indicating that absent a court order, deadly weapons lawfully seized out of domestic violence or violations of a protection order incidents will not be returned until such time as any orders of protection have expired. This once again gets to the gap. The situation that law enforcement officers encounter on a routine basis is they have an individual who, once again, is federally disqualified from possessing the weapon. They have that weapon in their property room because it's been seized as a result of an arrest for domestic violence or violation of a protection order. That individual is currently not lawfully able to possess that weapon, but state law doesn't cover what the law enforcement agency is supposed to do with that weapon. This would allow for a mechanism by which a court could review that. So it will say that the presumption is that they will keep it until such time as the order expires, and the court will make a determination. Firearms accessories. As I stated at the beginning, there were two gaps that we were seeking to be able to fill. One involved the state law, federal law gap, and the second involves the fact that the law 9.68 only seeks to cover firearms, firearm components, and firearms ammunitions. It doesn't discuss firearm accessories. As we know, the federal government is already contemplating going down this path as well. It currently does not exist under federal or state law, but there is some agreement, and there are a number of cities and states that are moving forward with the same argument that we're making, and that is that bump stocks and things along those lines are accessories and not components, firearms, or ammunition of themselves, and therefore are in the gap that we are able to legislate in. This provision would would prohibit a person from knowingly acquiring, having, carrying, or using an illegal rate of fire acceleration firearm accessory. It provides a definition for what an illegal rate of fire acceleration firearm accessory is. It gives a definition of how those mechanisms work, and then it also provides a laundry list of things that it would include, such as bump stocks, bump fire stocks, slide fires, and accelerators. So it's not meant to be a limiting list. There is a specific definition of what kind of a device would fall within the definition, and then there's a laundry list of things that would clearly fall within the definition. It is unlawful possession is a misdemeanor, punishable by up to 1 year in jail with a mandatory minimum jail term of at least 180 consecutive days. Interestingly enough, we don't have a forfeiture provision in here, and I know that someone had asked about that. The forfeiture provisions under the Ohio Revised Code, there's a specific group of things that can be considered an instrumentality, and in order to be considered an instrumentality, it has to be in that laundry list. Firearms are, but accessories are not. It could be argued that if you possess it, it is contraband, and if possessed as contraband, then we would be able, pursuant to existing state law, to seek to have it forfeited as contraband, but not as an instrumentality. Those are the gun ordinances. 1117-2018, imitation firearms. I believe this is the area where I would recommend to council to seek to have them public comment most. This particular area doesn't actually involve firearms. It involves things that appear to be firearms. And there are many potentially permissible uses for imitation firearms within a city. And I think we need to consider how best to go about regulating it. What we have in front of you is language that has been previously proposed at the General Assembly. It has some good definitions. It has some good framework to make those decisions within the city limits, and it puts forth some particular recommendations as to the exemptions that you might want to consider. So 235351, the definitions of imitation firearms. First thing I wanted to do, I'm sorry, thank you, is make clear that we're not talking about purely toy guns. There are states that have done that have outlawed any kind of toy gun, a Barbie gun, a G.I. Joe gun. But in this case, what we're specifically getting at is an imitation firearm is any BB device, replica of a firearm, or other device that is so substantially similar in coloration and overall appearance to an existing firearm as to lead a reasonable person to perceive that the device is a firearm. In other words, we're looking at imitation firearms that are trying to convince individuals that it is in fact a real gun. And that's where the definition comes from. And then there's a definition for BB device, and it talks about public places, and it provides some definitions that will become relevant for the other definitions and the other prohibitions in this section. Unlawful sale to minors is the first recommended piece of legislation. 2323.52, unlawful sale of imitation firearms to minors. Provision B, no person shall knowingly give, sell, or otherwise furnish an imitation firearm to any person under the age of 18. The question we want to ask is 18, is that the level we want to go to? Specifically, this age came from the proposal to the General Assembly. It might make sense to think about whether or not it's 16, 17, and to think about what the purposes are behind prohibiting it from going to minors. The concern, of course, is that an individual who is young and who might possess an imitation firearm that looks like a real gun might put themselves in harm's way and lack the maturity to recognize that they've put themselves there. The question is, where is that maturity line? Whoever violates this division, and it is, by the way, it's targeting the individual who's knowingly given, sold, or furnished it to the minor. Whoever violates this division is guilty of unlawful sale. It's a misdemeanor of the first degree. Alteration or possession. This is no person shall knowingly change, alter, remove, or obliterate any coloration, markings, or bands that are required by any applicable law or regulation of this state or the United States for any imitation firearm in a way that makes the imitation firearm or device look more like a firearm. B is no person shall knowingly possess an imitation firearm on which the blaze orange tip, which is specifically required by Title 15, Section 5001 of the United States Code, or any other colors or markings which may be required by city ordinance or state law to have been removed or obscured. Whoever violates A is a misdemeanor of the first degree, and violation of B is also a misdemeanor of the first degree. In this section now, again, looking at D, are there particular instances where this might not be prohibited? This section does not apply to a lawful use of an imitation firearm in any theatrical production, including any motion picture, video, television, or stage production. Think about whether or not we have a company that's coming in to film a movie in the city of Columbus. If they already have a permit to do so, would we want this law to apply to them if they're using imitation firearms in the filming of that movie? Illegal display. This is the only provision that actually includes a parallel state code violation. So paragraph A would be new. No person shall knowingly, openly display or expose any imitation firearm in a public place. And B already exists in state law. B is no person shall knowingly possess an imitation firearm in a school safety zone if the person indicates that the person possesses the object and that it is a firearm, or the person knowingly displays or brandishes the object and indicates that it is a firearm. Whoever violates A is guilty of illegal display in public, and B is, of course, in a school safety zone. What becomes important again are what exceptions might be permissible. So in the next section, Division D1 talks about possible exemptions for the imitation firearm in public. And without going through reading all of these, what we're looking at are things, well, what if it's in an area that's open to the public but that is used for paintball? What if it's in an area that's open to the public but it's used in conjunction with lawful hunting or pest control? What if it's used, something I learned, I went out to the police academy. If you are training at the police academy and you're not yet an OPATA officer, they give you an imitation firearm to use during your training. That's something we definitely want to consider including in the city code. So the idea is to make sure that we are looking towards where it might be acceptable because it's in a controlled environment and where it would be potentially dangerous because it's simply out on the street and it looks like it's a real gun. The other provision on the next page, these are the existing exemptions to the existing state law dealing with the school safety zone. So these are copied in their entirety. And it involves specifically having it in a school environment when it's under the direct supervision of an administrator, where there's a demonstration for purposes of ROTC or school safety training and things along those lines. So these specifically come from existing state law. Finally, there are penalty provisions on slide 23, and I'm almost done, I swear. The penalty provisions that are in italics, the F1 and F2, those provisions once again come from state law. So our intention here is to, as much as we can, mirror state law so that we're staying within 9.68. Even when we're talking about imitation firearms, an argument could be made that we're outside of 9.68. But to be extra careful, I've included the state law legislation and the state law penalty provisions. And in this case, the state law also includes a license suspension for specific acts. The other provision talks about if they've been previously convicted under state law, that would be a felony. So all of our ordinances where if prior convictions exist or if there are enhancing provisions that exist that under state law would make it a felony, we also exempt them out under city code because we cannot make a misdemeanor that which is a felony under the state code. And finally, 1118-2018, abating felony offenses of violence. This is the provision that City Attorney Klein referenced in his opening remarks. Specifically, the language itself is fairly simple, but it is constrained by the Supreme Court ruling, which is State ex rel pizza, of all things, from the 1960s, specifically talking about the fact that unless the owner either negligently or knowingly acquiesced to or participated in the behavior that constituted the nuisance, then that statute would be unconstitutional as applied. So we are limited by that decision, even though it's not contained within the language of the ordinance itself. So specifically, the recommendation is that we add to the public nuisance provision, including any building, premises, or real estate, including vacant land or any appurtenance thereto, on which a felony offense of violence is defined by Ohio Revised Code, and that's important too. It's a felony offense of violence, not any felony, has occurred. And then we specifically exempted out the felony violations, and it says 2919.25 or 2919.27. That's domestic violence and or violating a protection order. Clearly, in those instances, you have an individual who has been a victim in her own home, and we wouldn't want a defendant to be able to try and make an argument that she somehow acquiesced to or participated in her own victimization, particularly with those kinds of violations that are within your home. So that is the overview. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Solicitor General. You have unpacked a lot in these ordinances, and so I think it's appropriate at this time to open it up for questions or comments from my colleagues. President Pro Tem.
Thank you, President Hardin, and thank you for the presentation. I've appreciated the opportunity to discuss some of what you've presented today. Curious, and you noted it throughout the presentation, that we are reenacting a lot of state law. What is accomplished by doing that into the municipal code, and how does it address the overall not running afoul of ORC 9.68?
Thank you, Councilmember Stenziano. The purpose in reenacting it is to allow us, under circumstances under which it would be appropriate, to seek to have it, the weapons forfeited. Specifically, there is a provision, as I indicated in 2981 under the Ohio Revised Code, allowing for forfeiture and misdemeanor offenses of firearms. However, it must be included in the ordinance itself in order to do so. So in addition to all of the requirements within the complaint and the due process hearing, the ordinance itself must specifically reference that you can do so. Under state law, it does not. In terms of whether or not that would then be an expansion under 9.68, 9.68 and the provisions of 2981 were passed by the General Assembly within 2 weeks of one another, and 9.68 was passed first. So at the time that the General Assembly allowed for inclusion in municipal ordinances of this forfeiture provision, which specifically indicates firearms, they were aware of the fact that 2 weeks previously they had passed 9.68. So my argument would be that they were fully aware that they were giving us that allowance and authority to do so.
Ms. Baker-Morris, I have a question. You, in the imitation portion of the ordinance change, you referenced the maturity line in terms of the age. Are there similar engagements where law kind of dictates where that maturity line is based off of other potentially safety hazards to a minor?
There are different states and cities that have looked specifically at imitation firearms and have come to different age determinations. But I think the most common age line determination is, of course, in driving. You have individuals who are at various ages across the United States driving at different times. Obviously, that requires a certain level of maturity. It's a vehicle that has a lot of power, and some states have said you can drive at 14. Some states say you can't drive till 18. In Ohio, of course, it's 16.
Thank you. Any other comments right now from Ms. Baker-Morris? President Pro Tem, sorry.
Thank you, President Hardin. I apologize. I know the presentation had gotten long, but when we talk about the nuisance abatement, can you, either city attorney or the solicitor, explain kind of that process? Would it be a first call that would kind of trigger, or what would be envisioned with these new enactments that would create kind of kicking in these provisions, and how would it apply to what we currently have or would be enhancing?
I'll start by saying that I'm not an expert in nuisance abatement, but I did seek to get with one of my colleagues earlier today, Steve Dunbar, who is. And what I learned from talking to Steve and just from my experience with him is that no, it's usually not a first event type of situation. Generally what happens is that there have been multiple calls to a particular location that causes our interest to be drawn to that particular location. Once we have learned that there are concerns, we generally seek to find the owner, and we want to abate the nuisance. We try to work with them to bring to their attention what concerns have been raised and to try and get them to take various steps to make sure that they don't occur again. If that is not successful, either because they're not cooperative or we can't get them to do, or they're not willing, then of course the legal process would kick in. But even with the legal process, it's seeking an injunction at the beginning, and I'm thinking Councilmember Page can actually talk about this better than I can, but seeking an injunction at the beginning, going into court and making arguments about what kind of orders would be appropriate, and it's a long-term process. Sometimes it does result in the property being boarded up. Sometimes it results in the property being shut down permanently or temporarily, but it's definitely something that there is an opportunity to be heard by a court before those things would occur.
City Attorney, do you have any additional comments before we move on to our next speaker?
Thank you, President Hardin. Certainly want to give the opportunity to council to finish up any questions they have with Ms. Baker-Morrish. But I just want to close before we move on to Dr. Kessig and other folks that are talking about gun violence generally, just by saying that, of course, the City of Columbus and the City Attorney's Office has a duty to comply with the law, in this instance 9.68, and that we tried really hard to find common ground and to use common sense to address gun possession and criminality, keeping in mind all sides of the gun debate in this issue. I'm not too naive to think that everyone will agree with these proposals, but I am hopeful that some of those who have the purest interpretation of the Second Amendment will find that we are not focused on law-abiding citizens' gun ownership rights and possession rights, and rather that we were narrowly tailored these proposals to focus on individuals who have a violent and dangerous criminal history and their gun ownership and possession rights. The only folks that should be worried about these proposals are the abuser that has a domestic violence conviction, someone who's the subject of a criminal or civil protection order, and that I'm hopeful in the way that we do things in Columbus that we can find common ground and move forward together with support from all sides of the gun debate and dealing with individuals who have these criminal backgrounds and making sure that our city is safe and our neighborhoods are safe. So I appreciate Ms. Baker-Morrish's thorough presentation. I thought it was important when she reviewed the PowerPoint, when we talked about it, to err on the side of detail. The reality is this is nuanced. It is complicated. When you're operating within exceptions of state law, you just can't give blanket interpretations of what's going on. We appreciate council's opportunity to let us be heard. We look forward to the public testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, City Attorney, and thank you again, Ms. Baker-Morrish. Councilmember Mitch Brown.
Ms. Baker-Morrish, can you speak to the issue about imitation handguns? There is concern, obviously in the state of Ohio, we've had at least 2 individuals who have been shot by law enforcement officers believing that the individual had a handgun. How are we is this going to address that concern? We've had an issue here in the city of Columbus. We've had an issue in the state up in Cleveland, Ohio, and around this country about imitation firearms. So how is this legislation going to address that concern in your interpretation?
If you don't mind me answering that question, Council President Hardin, Chair Brown, Safety Chair Brown, I first want to note that there isn't one particular incident that triggered the conversation about what we could do about imitation firearms. You certainly highlighted 2 very high-profile tragic incidences where children were brandishing and possessing imitation firearms that ultimately led to a lethal use of force by law enforcement. I think that depending on where council draws the line, should they pass this ordinance as it relates to the possession and brandishing of imitation weapons, and what the age limit will be, could in fact, ideally, get the imitation weapon out of the hands of children who may be on the streets of Columbus. For one, that could be using those weapons in a nefarious criminal way, for instance, say robbing another person and that person believing that the imitation firearm is real. Or 2, sadly just playing with their friends and then having a neighbor call, which is, I think, the incident that happened in Cleveland at least, and then the one here in Columbus, there was the weapon was allegedly used for a robbery that then led to law enforcement coming onto the scene that ultimately led to the police-involved shooting. Getting children who lack the judgment and maturity of using these imitation firearms that look real, that objectively and subjectively the person who would be looking at the weapon would think that the weapon they're possessing is real, even though it's an imitation. Getting those weapons out of, or those imitation firearms out of the hands of those individuals, hopefully can save lives and can make our community safer, and frankly, move away from the judgment call that a 13 or 14 or 15-year-old has to make, and whether it's a wise choice to hold a weapon that is identical to that of a real weapon, to hold an imitation firearm that is identical to that of a real weapon.
City Attorney, also the issue of the coloration of the weapons, and I know there's references to taking the tips out, the orange tip, or trying to paint the weapon blue or something. Your perspective on that?
Well, I'll let Ms. Baker-Morrish talk about what federal regulations require as it relates to the blaze orange tip that would be required for an imitation weapon, but certainly the more alteration, coloring, or removal of anything that is designed to make the weapon look like a fake weapon, the more alteration of that to make it look more real, imperils the individual when they're possessing that weapon. To think that the average person that person has a real weapon, or a law enforcement officer that person has a real weapon. So if you alter the imitation weapon in a manner that makes the imitation weapon look more realistic, certainly can increase the likelihood of serious bodily harm, and that's something we simply don't want for our children in our community. And I think you referenced 2 high-profile, very sad incidences where, sadly, that was the case.
Thank you. Ms. Morris, did you wish to add?
Just briefly, I agree with everything that City Attorney Klein said. But yes, under federal law, if it is an imitation firearm, it's required to have the blaze orange tip. And the hope is with this prohibition here in the City of Columbus, we are also requiring that if it's required by federal law, that it have it here in the city as well. So the idea being that somebody who observes it from across a room would clearly see that blaze orange tip and recognize it as not being a true, real firearm.
Just to elaborate once more, what about at night involving law enforcement and their confrontation, heaven forbid, with someone, and whether or not you can or cannot distinguish a orange tip or whatever else it may be? For a law enforcement officer, that's a difficult decision to make when someone said the person has a gun.
Yeah, no, that is true, and I certainly can consider a situation where that might occur, and I don't know that we can solve every one of those possibilities. But what I can say is that blaze orange was picked for a particular reason. It is more visible than other colors are. It's why it's used for hunting, to basically to not be camouflaged, to be able to be observed, and that's why that specific color was chosen. But I can't say that just having the blaze orange tip will mean that it will never occur, but I can say that it is a step in the right direction.
Thank you, Council President, and I concur.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Page.
Thank you, President Hardin. I do have a question about, again, off of what Councilmember Brown was saying with the alteration and possession. For the exemptions or exceptions, are those applicable under federal law too?
They are not. There might be some provisions under the federal law where exemptions could exist, but largely there's a lot of latitude there where there's no specific requirement. It's more about what the particular locality might need.
Councilman Marimi.
One follow-up question on the nuisance abatement piece of it. This is of particular concern to the community. We've used nuisance abatement for a variety of reasons other than violence to shut down the hotels, and working with the city attorney and at that time council president Zach Klein about, to create legislation to handle those types of issues. You mentioned the Supreme Court case, the Ohio Supreme Court case. What limitations, could you clarify that a little bit? What limitations is that going to put on us if we were to enact that and say we had a problem operation within the city? What type of limitations will that put on us?
Essentially, it means that in order to make our case for shutting down a particular property, we would have to make our case that an owner had some knowledge or ought to have known. This is not be unique to felony offenses of violence. This is any time we want to seek to shut down an area that we determine might be a nuisance property. We have to give them notice of the fact that we believe that there is a violation. We have to give them specific direction in terms of what we want them to do to abate that particular nuisance. And we'd have to demonstrate that in some way, shape, or form they were either negligent, or they knowingly acquiesced to whatever happened, or they participated. So if an owner was actually participating in the offense of violence, that would be easy. If they were aware that they had repeatedly had calls coming out to their establishment, if they were aware that their practice of allowing their establishment to, I don't know, not card people or be open too late, or whatever that practice might be, resulted repeatedly in felonious assaults occurring, and if they didn't hire special duty officers, or if they didn't take care to hire security. And I'm giving you just hypothetical examples. But if we were aware, they were aware that whatever was going on their property was persistently resulting in these felony offenses of violence occurring, and they did nothing to attempt to alter the circumstances at their establishment, that's the kind of evidence that we would have to have in order to then bring it before a court and argue not only that it's a nuisance, but that they acquiesce to it.
May I, Council President? Council President, Council Member Remy, and I think just to piggyback on what Ms. Baker-Morrish indicated, is that when the city of Columbus shuts down a nuisance property, it's just simply not our discretion that we decide unilaterally that we are going to shut it down and board it up. As a matter of fact, all we can do, and we have been doing it very successfully with the great lawyers in the city attorney's office, and Councilmember Page being a former zone attorney, is all we can do is present to the court evidence that we believe is demonstrating a nuisance in our community. A court has to agree, an independent court, independent elected judge, in this instance the environmental court judge, has to agree with our assessment in order for us to be able to shut down the property. This is going to be no different. It will be one other arrow in our quiver to go and say, hey, here is a list of violent offenses that have occurred. The owner has had notice, or should have had notice. They have done nothing about it, and we believe because of this conduct, court, please grant this order to abate the nuisance and shut down the property. The city alone does not have unilateral authority to do that. We can only do it with the agreement of an independently elected judge that reviews our request and agrees with us.
Thank you, City Attorney. At this time, we're going to move to our next speaker. It's Dr. Kessig, Medical Director for the Columbus Division of Fire. Welcome to Council.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Council President Hardin, City Attorney Klein, and members of City Council, I appreciate the opportunity to provide commentary on the physical effects of gunshots on the human body. As an emergency physician for nearly 40 years now, I have taken care of many victims of gun violence, both here in Ohio and also in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, a number of those patients lost their lives due to gun violence, and I remember every one of them. When a bullet enters the body, the speed at which it travels, the angle at which it hits the body, and the density of the tissue involved all contribute to the damage that the shot can cause. It can immediately disrupt bone, tendon, nerve, muscle, artery, vein, and vital organs. Depending on the caliber of the bullet, it can leave a trail of cavitation that sometimes is an inch or more in diameter. And when it exits the body, it usually leaves a much bigger and devastating hole than when it entered. Bullets often fragment and leave pieces all along the cavitation trail, which cause more damage. A shock wave accompanies the cavitation trail that causes injury to adjacent structures. The injury inflicted by a bullet is directly related to the bullet's kinetic energy. This is a measure of the bullet's weight, velocity, and gravitational trajectory. The combination of the three describes how much damage a bullet will cause. A bullet that passes through the body, creating an exit wound, generally will cause less damage than one which stays in the body, because a bullet that stays in the body transfers all of its kinetic energy and ensures maximum damage to tissue. If a bullet from a handgun strikes, for example, a liver, it injures the organ by poking a hole and causing tissue disruption around the path of the bullet. But with a rifle round, you have massive tissue disruption, 3 to 4 inches around that same tissue. Expanding bullets, especially if shot from an assault rifle, can discharge bullets much faster than a handgun. Once they enter the body, they fragment and explode, pulverizing bones, tearing blood vessels, and liquefying organs. These bullets can strike a person in a relatively non-lethal area of the body, but still have the potential to kill because of the enormous damage they can do to the surrounding tissues. In the recent unfortunate Parkland High School shooting, where the shooter used an AR-15 rifle, a radiologist examining the CT scans of the victims commented that the organs looked like overripe melons smashed by a sledgehammer, and I quote. She also commented that a typical A-15 bullet leaves the barrel traveling almost 3 times faster than and imparting more than 3 times the energy of a typical 9mm bullet from a handgun. There are estimates that the annual society cost of gun violence exceeds $229 billion. But the human costs are comprised of not just death, but also of survival. Because of spinal damage, patients become paralyzed, unable to walk, sometimes unable to move anything from the neck down. Because of blood loss and infections, sometimes patients undergo limb amputations. Because of intestinal perforations, they wear colostomy bags to take care of their bowel function. Many require multiple surgeries followed by a lifetime of hospitalizations from antibiotic-resistant infections and chronic unremitting pain, and as a result, some become addicted to painkillers. They face a downward spiral of unemployment and poverty, homelessness and hopelessness. If a bystander witnesses gun violence, the first thing to do, if possible, is to stop the bleeding. Researchers studying American war zones have attributed 90% of preventable deaths to uncontrolled bleeding. So anyone can control hemorrhaging by applying manual pressure or by fastening a tourniquet, improvised or commercial, high and tight on the limb. Here in Columbus, we've tried to be very proactive in approaching the issue of gun violence. Our Columbus Division of Fire EMS providers are taught how to treat gunshot victims to give them every opportunity for survival. We also have excellent trauma facilities here in Columbus that use cutting-edge techniques to stabilize patients and get them to the operating room in record times. The Central Ohio Trauma System, known as COTS, provides a forum for EMS personnel, nurses, physicians, and hospital leaders to track our performance in treating gunshot victims and always trying to develop ways to improve survival. So in summary, gunshot wounds are usually devastating, but not only from the damage that it does physically, but also the social, economic, and emotional impact it has on families and on communities. A bullet is no respecter of race, gender, creed, wealth, or station in life. It is an equal opportunity destroyer. Thank you. I'll be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kasich, for your comments, and thank you for your life-saving service to our community. Are there any questions from my colleagues? Thank you.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Dr. Kasich.
Dr. K.
Councilmember Brown.
Dr. Kasich, and certainly in your many, many years of experience involving trauma, your concerns with regards to not only the individual who is impacted by a gunshot wound, but those who witness gunshot wounds. Is it not true that post-traumatic stress associated with that can be equally as devastating for people in terms of their ability to recover? We've seen in our community, unfortunately, lots of young people who have witnessed violence from guns. And if I'm not correct, Children's Hospital is embarking on some programs to try to address that concern. Is that correct, sir?
I'm not real familiar with what Children's is doing, Councilmember Brown, but as far as your comments about post-traumatic stress syndrome, it definitely affects the bystanders, the family members, the community members that actually witness the horrific effects of any kind of gunshot violence. And unfortunately, in some communities, those effects are additive because the violence continues to occur, the people in those communities continue to see it, and the trauma, I think, is incalculable in terms of the effects that it has, not only for the immediate effect, but down the road over the years. Sometimes those things are just unforgettable.
And also, Dr. Kasich, there's been some reference to the fact that bullets, again, are indiscriminate, and they travel at such a high rate of speed that they go through things and hit others.
That's correct.
And the impact associated with that from your perspective, sir.
Well, obviously, we're all familiar with victims of gunshot wounds that were not the intended victims. And so with the high velocity of these weapons and the rapid velocity that they have, they can certainly go through metal, they can go through people, windows, and hit unintended targets, and certainly cause tragic results.
Thank you, Dr. Kessie. Next speaker we have in council is Deputy Director Kate Bisciotti. Thank you, Director, for being here.
Good evening, President Hardin, members of council, City Attorney Klein. On behalf of the Department of Public Safety, I would like to express our gratitude for putting forward these critical ordinances that aim to reduce gun violence, protect victims of domestic violence, and remove dangerous weapons from neighborhoods. The Columbus Division of Police is an extremely busy department covering 222 square miles with 865,000 residents, which is larger than Cleveland and Cincinnati combined. In 2016 and 2017 alone, the division answered nearly 1.3 million calls for service. Of those calls, tens of thousands of them were violent calls for service, including stabbings, shootings, or persons with guns, that resulted in over 5,100 firearms being recovered. Last year, we had an unprecedented number of homicides, 143. 117 of those were committed with a firearm. This year so far, we have had 31 homicides to date, 23 have been committed with a firearm. To the families that lost a loved one, a neighborhood that lost a neighbor, and a city who lost a resident, we must be vigilant in not reducing this loss of life down to a statistic. In 2016 and 2017, the police responded to over 68,000 domestic violence calls. As we know, domestic violence runs are one of the most dangerous calls for our police officers. The most recent example is of the 2 Westerville officers that were tragically killed while responding to a domestic violence call. Part of the legislation here tonight will take action to protect all victims of domestic violence and assault by including intimate partner violence. We believe that passage of this ordinance will serve to better protect the residents and our police. The Public Safety Department appreciates Mayor Ginther, City Attorney Klein, and Council President Hardin for putting forward these common sense regulations to reduce gun violence for not only the residents of Columbus, but for our first responders. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Director. Are there any comments from my colleagues? Councilmember Page.
Thank you, President Hardin. I do have one quick question for Director Bisciotti. If this legislation is enacted, how quickly do you believe the Division of Police will be trained so that they know the new laws and how to enforce them?
I think that the good news is that they're aware of them. Jeff Furby, who's the legal advisor for police, will get that on board as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Any additional questions from my colleagues? Seeing none, and thank you again, Director. We'll turn the floor over to our Health Commissioner, Commissioner Mashika Roberts.
Good evening, and thank you, Council President Hardin, members of City Council, and City Attorney Klein. Thank you for having me here this evening. As you've heard, gun violence is an issue in our community. It's the leading cause of premature death in the U.S., and I feel strongly that it is a public health issue. In communities across our country, guns kill more than 38,000 people each year and cause nearly 85,000 injuries. Our community, as mentioned by many before, is not immune to this. In 2017, there were 654 suspected gunshot wound visits in our local ERs. And as you just heard from Deputy Director Bisciotti, we had a unprecedented 143 homicides in 2017, of which 117 of those were due to gunshots or firearms. While we have primarily talked about homicides, we also know that guns have been involved with suicides. Just here in Franklin County in 2017, 83 individuals succumbed to their own wounds from firearms due to suicide. Now, these are a lot of numbers, but as many have mentioned, these numbers are family members. They're members of our communities, their mothers, their fathers, their sisters, their brothers, and they're our neighbors. While the legislation that is being presented tonight does not explicitly aim at reducing suicides or some of the other injuries that I mentioned, these rules will likely impact those numbers by keeping dangerous weapons out of our neighborhoods. Furthermore, the trauma caused by gun violence cannot be understated, not just for the victim and their family, but really for the entire community. That's why Columbus Public Health is taking steps to complement the goals underlying these ordinances. Last year, Columbus Public Health worked with City Council to assemble the CARE Coalition to tackle trauma in our neighborhoods. The CARE Coalition, which stands for Community, Action, Resiliency, and Empowerment, provides direct outreach to residents impacted by gun violence and other traumatic experiences to help connect them to services and build resiliency in families as well as neighborhoods. I also chair the Violent Crime Review Group, which is part of Mayor Ginther's comprehensive neighborhood safety strategy to analyze homicides in the pilot neighborhood of Linden on a case-by-case basis to identify underlying trends and potential intervention strategies. Gun violence is a complex public health issue that needs to be addressed in the same way we address other public health challenges, such as infant mortality and opiates. Recognizing gun violence as a matter of public health is the first step, and I believe we have done that right here in Columbus, and I thank you all for your support in that. Now the Mayor's comprehensive neighborhood safety strategy, as well as the legislation you're considering this evening, is creating what I believe to be a healthier and safer Columbus for all of our residents. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner, and certainly thank you for your leadership. The partnership between this council and the administration under your leadership for the CARE Coalition and others that deal with trauma and gun violence as a public health issue is certainly appreciated by us, but I think appreciated by the community as well. And to see that work in action is really, it gives hope for a safer community, especially this summer.
Thank you. On behalf of all my colleagues, I thank you.
Sure. Councilmember Brown.
Director Roberts, when you say you wish to identify it as a public health issue, give me some comparisons with other circumstances. If we had 143 people die of some other potential problem, what type of resources will we bring to bear to try and solve that problem?
Well, you know, public health prides itself on how we try to prevent issues. And so when we talk about infant mortality, we try to prevent those deaths. When we talk about opiates, we talk about how to prevent people from even starting down the path of drug use. When we talk about safety on the roads, we talk about telling people to buckle up and not text and drive. So it's about prevention. So I think many of the legislation items that have been mentioned this evening are the prevention items, particularly getting some of these firearms off the street so they're not in the hands of individuals and they don't run to them when they get upset about something and use them in a way that could be very deadly to those they're involved in, as well as some of the toy guns that are out there. I mean, that to me is a definite public health intervention that we need to work on. Individuals should not be running around our community with toy guns and thinking that someone is not going to mistake it for a real gun at some point in time. So again, public health tries to get ahead of things and prevent things, and that's why from a public health standpoint, gun violence is something we think we can prevent if we can help our community learn how to deal with challenges as opposed to resulting to a gun, and then first and foremost, getting the guns out of the hands of those who should not have guns in the first place. I hope that answered your question, Councilmember Brown.
Yes, part of the issue, Dr. Roberts, is that we had 38,000 people die last year from gun violence, correct?
Correct, across the nation.
So around the country, are your colleagues, are others addressing this concern as well? And are we learning from them about what we can do here in the city of Columbus? If we had any other entity where we had 38,000 people dying from the exact same problem, wouldn't we have all kinds of issues with people screaming and hollering about how to solve the problem?
Well, absolutely, and in talking to my peers at other local health departments across the country, they're all dealing with this and trying to get into this arena of what public health can do to work with their partners in police, as well as work with their elected officials to reduce gun violence. It's a complex issue like many issues. It's, you know, removing the guns is one part, but helping people learn how to navigate and deal with difficult situations, deal with their emotions, and so that's not the first thing they think of or they run to is a gun. And empowering our youth to figure out ways to negotiate situations that don't involve violence. And so whether it's a gun, whether it's a knife, whether it's a fight, how they can talk through a situation to deal with their differences.
And just to follow up again, conflict resolution, if I'm not mistaken, the age group for those 38,000 still remain between the ages of, what, 15 to 30 or 15 to 40? I mean, so people in their most productive years of their lives are being taken with gun violence that is undeniably preventable.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Burr, and thank you again, Dr. Roberts. Our final speaker to come before us, before we go to our public speakers, is Ms. Sue Valillo from Choices for Victims of Domestic Violence. Welcome, Ms. Valillo.
Thank you, Council President Hardin. Good evening to you, City Council members, and City Attorney Klein. Again, my name is Sue Valillo. I'm the Executive Director of LSS Faith Mission and Choices for Victims of Domestic Violence. Tonight, I'm here to testify in support of the proposed ordinances, particularly as they relate to closing the gap between state and federal regulation and the city's efforts to further protect victims of domestic violence. LSS Choices offers a shelter for victims fleeing domestic violence, the only one in Franklin County. As a result, we work with a diverse population of people, but one commonality is their ongoing concern for their safety. This concern is grounded in the reality that our clients have already suffered physical violence at the hands of their abuser, and the threat of further violence looms over them. In this moment, I cannot help but think of Linda. Petite and quiet, she entered shelter after years of being beaten, only when her abuser shot and killed one of their dogs to teach her what he was capable of. Or of Tasha, whose husband barricaded himself inside her home with a gun and their small child while threatening to kill them both in an effort to terrorize her far more than the physical violence ever could. Both of these situations, with the help of Columbus police, ended with getting the victims and the child into Choices shelter, but this isn't always the case. In July of 2017, the CDC released a report evidencing that more than half of all homicides of women in the United States are the result of domestic violence. For the research period from 2003 to 2014, almost 54% of those homicides were the result of the use of a gun. In Ohio, from July 1st, 2016 to June 30th of 2017, there were 116 domestic violence-related fatalities in the state. In just that 1 year, the Ohio Domestic Violence Network tells us of those 116 deaths, 86% resulted from the use of a gun. The link between a homicide of a domestic violence victim and the use of a gun cannot be denied. As all City Council members know, LSS Choices works with the Columbus Police Department, Franklin County Sheriff, and 19 other police municipalities within Franklin County on the lethality assessment program. This police protocol requires officers to conduct a brief lethality assessment with victims on every domestic violence call. When the victim screens as high danger, meaning they are likely to be seriously harmed or killed, the officer calls Choices Crisis Hotline with the victim for an immediate link to safety and services. This assessment is an evidence-based tool that predicts fatality. Of the 11 questions on the assessment, 2 are about the use of a weapon and access to a firearm. This is one of the leading predictors of a homicide. According to the American Journal of Public Health, the presence of a gun in a domestic violence situation increases the likelihood of a homicide for women by 500%. Given this indisputable correlation between the presence of a gun and a fatality in a domestic violence situation, state and federal law have been enacted to protect domestic violence victims. The legislation presented here today in Columbus mirrors these current laws. The pending legislation expands the definition of domestic violence to include victims of dating violence, a necessary step to ensure all victims of domestic violence are able to access full protection under the law. It will prohibit possession of a gun if a person is convicted of a misdemeanor domestic violence charge or subject to a protection order. It requires a 6-month minimum sentence when a protection order is violated if the perpetrator possessed or carried a firearm during the commission of the offense. The legislation further requires firearms be surrendered and retained in connection with an arrest for domestic violence or violation of a protection order. While there's debate around sensible gun legislation, the likelihood of a tragic outcome in a domestic violence situation when a gun is present is not debatable. It is known. We can prevent the murder of domestic violence victims by removing guns from the hands of those already known to have committed crimes of violence against them. This legislation is clear in its intent: to be consistent with state and federal laws that have been enacted to protect victims of domestic violence from known abusers, to reduce the likelihood of homicide and improve the safety and quality of life for those who have suffered enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lillo, for your testimony. Thank you for the work that you do each and every day in our community. Are there any questions or comments from my colleagues? Seeing none, we will move to the public speaker portion of this evening's agenda at the public hearing. Just a reminder that public speakers have 3 minutes to speak on an issue, and we ask that you state your name, your address, and if you represent any organization. The first speaker to come before council is Mr. Malik Moore. Mr. Moore, welcome to council.
Thank you, Council President. Malik Moore, 40 West Long Street. Tonight I'm representing the CARE Coalition, part of Columbus Public Health. And thank you, members of council. Thank you, Attorney Klein. And I just want to take my 3 minutes today to share just how powerful it is to see the work you're doing and the legislation you're working on and its impact on the communities that feel the impact of the bullets and the trajectories of violence that we heard spoken about tonight. We heard the medical doctor from the fire department share in vivid terms what a bullet does. And then we've also heard Dr. Roberts share what that trauma means and how it ripples throughout our communities. And so the CARE Coalition she shared stands for Community, Action, Resilience, and Empowerment. And so what I want to just do again is thank you all for creating the air support for us, for the folks that are working on the ground, seeing the people who have been harmed. And I work with a mentee at Lyndon McKinley STEM who was shot 2 years ago on a playground of a school. And he got to speak at the vigil, and fortunately for him, because he has one of the biggest things that helps with resilience, he has relationships with people that care about him. And so what I want to just remind us of is as we pass this legislation, as we look at the impact of the bullets, let's think about the other people that we talked about that feel the impact and feel that trauma. And so with the CARE Coalition, one of the things we share very often is that when trauma happens to one of us, it happens to all of us. And so again, I understand that this is a holistic community approach, and I'm grateful for that. And I just want us to continue to work together and know that the work you're doing is appreciated, and the families in the community are grateful, and I'm grateful as well. So that's all I wanted to share this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Are there any questions from my colleagues? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
The next person to come before council is Sarah Muncie, I apologize. Welcome to council. Just a reminder, you have 3 minutes to speak, and if you would give us your name, your address, and any organization that you may represent.
Thank you, President Hardin and members of the council. My name is Sarah Muncy. I am a volunteer with Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, and I live at 653 Cuyahoga Court. I wanted to thank you today for taking steps to reduce gun violence in our city. We know that this has been an issue that has been increasing over the past several years. And as I stated, I am also a volunteer with Moms Demand Action, and our group advocates for gun safety and for passing legislation that keeps guns out of the hands of those with dangerous histories. These proposed measures tonight are a step in the right direction, and we are thankful that our leaders are offering sensible solutions to promote gun safety in our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Muncy, and thank you for the work of the organization. Are there any questions from my colleagues? Thank you for being here this evening. The next speaker to come before council is John Slaughter. Mr. Slaughter, welcome to council. You have 3 minutes to speak. If you give your name, your address, and any organization you may represent. Welcome.
Thank you, President Hardin, council members. My name is John Slaughter. I live at 2268 Maplewood Drive. My comments were that a lot of the testimony that I've heard tonight, other than from Mr. Klein and the Solicitor General, was pretty much anti-gun, especially from the doctor from the fire department. Just to let you know, I think that we need to be addressing the problems that we face by finding out where these guns are coming from. We need to be getting the guns. They're not going into gun stores to purchase them if they're a felon. They're not, if they're 17 years old, they're not going and getting the guns at a gun store. So what we need to do, my suggestion would be, council members, start some kind of a solicitation from the police department to attempt to determine where these guns are coming from, rather than trying to say guns are bad all across the board and everything. Learn where these kids are getting the guns. We also need to be looking at prosecuting the individuals that are providing those guns to the kids. The parents, if they're not securing the guns, are we prosecuting the parents as well as looking into what's going on with why they're getting the gun in the first place? The other thing is I'm aware of several situations to where guns have been provided to felons on a straw purchase. The only case that I'm really aware of that is being prosecuted is the one with regard to the Westerville officers being brutally murdered. The rest of the cases, the prosecutors don't seem like they want to take the time to deal with the individual doing the straw purchase. One of the comments that I actually heard from a prosecutor was, we don't want to hurt this individual's non-record, which allowed them to make these purchases in the first place. Well, if you don't do something to stop or to make a deterrent for individuals purchasing weapons and providing them to felons or individuals that are under disability, then there's no deterrent there, and they're going to continue doing this. So again, I think a study should be undertaken by council to attempt to determine where these individuals are getting these weapons, and then you work from those measures rather than across the board saying guns are bad, we want to do this, because I understand what Mr. Klein was saying about the regulations and things, and we don't want to take guns out of the hands of regular individuals. However, the mayor mentioned they wanted to, or he was looking at doing something in regards to AR-15s and other weapons. So I think that I don't want it to lead to from one thing lead to another. Appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Slaughter. I thought that was very thoughtful feedback. Could somebody, city attorney or Ms. Morris Baker, speak to, because one of the points that you hit on was really we have illegal guns out in the streets, and I remember in our first conversation about this, talked about it, but there are issues and preemptions that prohibit us from doing some of that work, and I think the city attorney or Ms. Laura could speak to that in a little bit more.
Council President Hardin and members of council, I will start off a comment and I'll let Ms. Baker Morris bat clean up. But the comments, let me echo that some of the things that you raised, Mr. Slaughter, I think are legitimate, which in fact is why we are passing a city misdemeanor weapons under disability law. The reality is we can only act because our hands are tied because of Ohio Revised Code 9.68. The state legislature, in their wisdom, decided they didn't want municipalities to be able to perhaps enforce some of the things that you directly address, like straw purchasing. As you noticed, the federal government is prosecuting the individual who was the straw purchaser for the defendant in the Westerville shooting case. The reality is the Department of Justice has to prioritize those because of manpower, and they have made the priorities for the highest profile and the most serious offenders. We stand ready in the city of Columbus, as evidenced by this particular piece of legislation, to figure out in those areas where we can act. Now, unfortunately, in the areas that we can act, we are limited to the sentence that we can impose. In this instance, in the Weapons Under Disability Act, or the Weapons Under Disability misdemeanor, it could be up to 180 days in jail. But our hands are tied in what we can do. Certainly willing to advocate for us to be able to be the enforcer of that. As you heard, I think Deputy Director Kate Bisciotti mentioned, how many guns did they seize off the street last year that were illegal? I'm sorry? Over 1,500 guns, is that what it was?
It was over 5,100.
5,100 guns. I mean, it certainly is a priority, and we are of limited jurisdiction. I'm not trying to say that as an excuse as much as it's just the reality of what the city can do. We're not the county prosecutor, and we're not the U.S. Attorney's Office. But as the prosecutor for the city of Columbus, we stand ready to find where we can have expansive powers to hold criminals and those who are breaking current laws accountable. But we only can do that within the provisions of 9.68 and where those exceptions exist. Ms. Baker Morris.
Yes, I was going to add to that. One of the specific areas that we would like to be able to regulate but are prohibited from regulating would go to exactly what you're speaking about, and that is individuals who are able to sell to individuals who are disabled under federal law. And part of the problem is that a number of those sales occur at gun shows, or they occur private to private, hand-to-hand transactions. And what we are unable to do because of 9.68 is to enact any kind of registry or any kind of background check requirement for those individuals because we're preempted by state law. And the only way to effectively determine when that has occurred is to have some sort of a registration for those weapons. So we discussed that. We wish we could, but that's one of the limitations that we face.
I guess just one of the other points was that, and I understand where you're coming from and everything, but I think that if you look at all the statistics across the board, you'll find that the majority of all these violent crimes and everything are being committed by criminals. They're not being committed by law-abiding citizens who are concerned about more gun regulations coming out of D.C., coming out of the State House, or coming from the city. And, I think that maybe concentrating on the grassroots of where's this criminal activity coming from, maybe giving a little bit more under Terry v. Ohio back to the police department rather than not allowing them to maybe effectively do their jobs that they possibly could do. That might get some of the guns at least off the street, or at least make people wary that there are people out there looking, because I know that it wasn't a big hit, the summer initiative, but it seemed like the police were out there doing what they thought was best and the right thing, trying to limit the amount of criminal activity going on in the neighborhood. And I think those are the kind of programs to where you start to try to prevent these type of crimes from occurring and the weapons being in the wrong people's hands and eventually maybe committing a crime or something like that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Slaughter.
Well, may I, Council President?
Sir.
To address Mr. Slaughter's point, I think that's why we were intentionally focused in this legislation on the intersection of criminality and gun possession. Those who have domestic violence convictions, those who do have felonious convictions, those who are currently the subject of a protection order, steering clear of those individual law-abiding citizens who, in the protection of their gun rights. I mean, you mentioned, the Terry v. Ohio case. I'm sure as someone who's an ardent defender of the Constitution like yourself that would want to give the utmost respect, not just to the Second Amendment, but unreasonable searches and seizures under the Fourth. I will say that our not speaking on behalf of the Department of Public Safety, but if there is criminality out there and there are reasonable searches and stops to get guns off the streets of the city of Columbus, our officers are prepared to do that. They've done that with the 5,100 that have come off the streets, and with resources being dedicated to various aspects of human trafficking and otherwise, gun possession and illegal gun possession and, of criminals is certainly a priority as well. But balancing all the constitutional factors, the Fourth Amendment search and seizure, just the same that we want to give to the Second Amendment rights, I think is an important balance in making sure that we are getting guns off the street, but at the same time protecting Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens. So we'd hope to have your support for this testimony because it is the intersection of criminality and irresponsible gun ownership, and we'd love to have your support for this particular piece of legislation.
Totally agree, and I just want to say that I appreciate all the work that Columbus Police do.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. The next speaker to come before council is Katrina Darris. Ms. Katrina, welcome to council. You have 3 minutes to speak. If you'd give your name, your address, and any organization that you may represent.
My name is Katrina Darms. I live at 90 West 2nd Avenue. Thank you, Council President Hardin and City Council. Today, I'm focused on the banning of bump stocks, which I think is one of the most critical issues proposed today. I think banning bump stocks is common sense gun control, and there's no legitimate reason not to do it. As I understand it, there are 2 things that gun owners need their weapons for: hunting and self-defense. A semi-automatic rifle fires 150 rounds per minute, more than twice per second. A bump stock enables the same firearm 500 rounds per minute. It can be straightforwardly understood that you do not need that much destructive capacity for hunting. Now, self-defense. The fact of the matter is, if you're trained in firing a gun, you have easy access to it, and there's an intruder in your home, a handgun is going to be just as deadly as an automatic weapon. So there's really no reason for bump stocks in that situation either. I'm a sophomore in high school, and I have been following the news closely. I don't want to become another student killed in a school shooting, and bump stocks only make the job of a school shooter easier. No one should feel unsafe going to school. Semi-automatic weapons are more than sufficient to defend ourselves, and the only people who want bump stocks are criminals. Men like Stephen Paddock, who used bump stocks to kill 58 people and injure 422 in a matter of minutes. And I don't want men like that in Columbus. Massachusetts, New Jersey, Denver, and Columbia have already taken action to ban bump stocks. I urge you all to support this important legislation and add Columbus to that list. Thank you.
Thank you for your advocacy, Ms. Darms. Are there any questions from my colleagues? Thank you so much. The next speaker that we have before council is Olivia Wesley Sherman. Olivia, welcome to council. Again, if you just give us your name, your address, and if you represent any organization.
My name is Olivia Wesley Sherman, and I live at 161 South Roosevelt Avenue. Good evening, Council President Hardin and City Council members. My name is Olivia Wesley Sherman, and I'm 15 years old and a freshman in high school. Today I'm speaking in favor of the ordinance to ban bump stocks in Columbus. So you all know that the Las Vegas shooter used bump stocks on AR-15s to shoot more rounds. However, I find it important to remind you just how much damage was done using a bump stock in this shooting last October. AR-15s are already semi-automatic, but adding a bump stock allows it to shoot 9 rounds per second. Using this device, the shooter in Las Vegas shot over 1,000 rounds. This killed 58 people and left over 400 others with gunshot injuries. These numbers are disturbingly high. Nobody needs to fire 9 rounds per second. No recreational shooter needs to fire that quickly in any circumstance ever. I can't even comprehend how fast 9 rounds per second is, but I do know how deadly the Las Vegas massacre was. All of those numbers I said, rounds fired and lives lost, All of that occurred within 10 minutes. 58 people were killed in 10 minutes. 58 people with families, passions, and dreams. There were thousands of bullets fired. Bump stocks allowed the shooter to fire as much as he did. Banning bump stocks, even just in Columbus, would be such an important step in addressing the gun violence epidemic in America. I read an article that argued that bump stocks allow people to get the thrill of shooting a machine gun. If somebody wants a thrill, they can just ride a roller coaster. There's no good reason to legally sell gun accessories that make shooting so much faster. Students like me and my classmates are tired of hearing the news of another mass shooting practically every month. We're sick of the heartbreak we feel when we find out that other students, just like us and our friends, were killed at their school, a place where they were supposed to feel safe. We need to do something to start on the long road to getting better gun control in the United States. Let Columbus act as a leader in the nationwide gun crisis, and let that start with banning bump stocks. Thank you all for allowing me to speak at today's hearing.
Thank you, Ms. Wesley Sherman. Thank you for your advocacy. It is very clear that you don't have to wait to turn 18 to be an advocate and to encourage common sense measures. Thank you. The next speaker that we have before council is Julia Alwin. Julia, welcome to council. Just a reminder, if you would state your name, your address, and any organization that you may represent. Welcome to council.
My name is Julia Alwine. I live on 141 Wetmore Road, and I represent an organization. Okay. First, I would like to say it encourages me to hear City Council finally speaking about proposing gun regulations. However, it is a phrase at the beginning of this session that struck me. It was stated that this has been a collaborative process with City Council, and then they went on to list their partners. However, one partner was noticeably missing, and that was community partners. Partners such as the People's Justice Project have been talking about the epidemic of gun violence that specifically affects marginalized community for years, yet City Council is just now addressing this issue. I want voices from the community to also be heard. We are glad that City Council is finally committing to taking action, but one town hall to hear student and community voices is not enough. Furthermore, it is almost 7 o'clock, and I, like the other students who have spoken, have school and responsibilities tomorrow. Not every student can make it to a late Thursday night meeting, but that does not mean they do not have an important message and perspective on this issue. When speaking on an issue that so closely affects our Columbus students, I asked the City Council why they are not more actively seeking out the student voice or creating situations where student voices and community members are heard. We are who you are representing, yet we are the last to be given a seat at the table. I urge the Council to reach out and find ways to truly hear student and community voices, because the place to look when making our community safer is the community themselves. Furthermore, another phrase that struck me was hiring more police officers to ensure safety. As a student and a community organizer, this phrase makes me feel the opposite of safe. I am glad to hear the City Council address not only school shootings, but the way gun violence disproportionately affects communities of color in our city. However, when speaking about how gun violence affects these communities of color, we cannot ignore another form that runs rampant in Columbus, police brutality that has victimized citizens such as Henry Green. For example, I am frustrated and disheartened to hear the city attorney discussion of the two incidents that Councilman Michael Brown brought up, where an imitation firearm was used as justification to shoot an Ohio citizen. He categorized these incidents as two high-profile, sad incidences, instead of looking at them as indicative of a larger and systemic problem where police officers criminalize and use excessive force against those deemed threatening, not for the weapons they carry, but for the color of their skin. This is an incredibly sad instance, yes, but it cannot just be categorized that way and then dismissed. It is an example of another kind of gun violence, and not only that, but a common kind of gun violence in our city, one that does not only occur in sad, high-profile instances. Until our city first includes student and community voices on a larger scale, and secondly, make sure to address the way our police officers utilize their firearms in their own form of gun violence, These proposed regulations will not be sufficient, and our communities will not truly be safe. Thank you.
Julie, thank you so much for coming down. Thank you for your testimony. It is our hope, and we strive to make sure that community engagement is our top priority. I would say in no small part was this hearing, this legislation, and certainly the space to have this conversation granted to us by young people speaking up, standing up, and demanding action. We are actually proud of the work that we're doing to respond as quickly as we can with common sense legislation to keep our community safe. And we want to keep everybody in our community safe, regardless of skin color or age. And we believe that this legislation does that. Like I said, we really do appreciate your advocacy. We appreciate your voice. We appreciate others who want to continue to link arms with us and to have this important conversation. We don't believe that one public hearing or one piece of legislation will solve the issues that you spoke of. But I believe that working together continuously, continuing to be engaged, and continuously to speak out, will get there and have a safer Columbus. So thank you. I look forward to getting your information. So as we have further conversations, as we have further community engagements, and maybe you can help us develop a community conversation at your school. What school do you attend?
Columbus Alternative High School.
You sound like a Pegasus. Thank you.
Thank you.
From one Pegasus to another. The next speaker to come before council, were there any comments from my colleagues? The next speaker to come before council is Crystal Turner. Ms. Turner, welcome to council. Just a reminder, you state your name, your address, and in any organization that you may represent.
Good evening, Crystal Turner, 6406 Rossmore Lane. I am actually standing on behalf of every mother in our community who has lost a child to gun violence. Thank you, President Hardin, councilmen, and those of you who are in participation. I stand here in support of the gun initiative as a mother who has lost 2 children to gun violence. This was a very important meeting for me. I've taken a couple of notes. I'm going to be within that 3 minutes, I promise. One of the things I wanted to impact on or make a statement is in regards to the young lady who just spoke. As I applaud all of the work that's being done, I think one of the key pieces of this puzzle in solving or answering the question, not why did it happen, but when did our community begin to change that our only alternative to resolving issues was to use violence, is the piece of that puzzle is those who are personally affected. I also apologize as a community member that I didn't become involved until it personally knocked at my door, that I began to become better knowledgeable of the laws and how violence actually affects a community as a whole. It doesn't just affect a home, it affects all of us. So with that being said, I piggyback off of her comment of including us, not just at the table, but including us to be a part of the solution because we have a personal story that we're able to share on how violence has affected us, which leads me to the next point of trauma. I've also, in my research, been able to become now part of what's being called the grand family as a result of violence. With the 2010 census, as of that census, at that time we had 4.9 million children who are now permanently living with grandparents as a result of other issues, but violence being one of them and death being another one, which simply means 1 out of every 10 children are living with grandparents. 1 out of every 4 of those 10 are permanently living with grandparents, which takes us into a whole nother part that we haven't began to discuss is how those families now are beginning to live new normal lives without loved ones, but how their housing is affected, their income is affected, how they're going to take care of those grandchildren who may have lost parents, who may not have already paid into Social Security, who may not have left funds for those families to take care of them. But even more importantly, when we talk about the trauma that is affected, and I'm going to leave it with this note, my 8-year-old grandson recently said to me, he is carrying the guilt because he remembers that his father had bullets that he saw, and he didn't tell his mom. He believes that if he would have told his mom that his dad had bullets, that his mother would still be here. So when we talk about the trauma, we talk about the fact that our trauma now is lifelong. And every day we're forced to wake up and figure out how we're going to live a new life, not just without the loss of a family member, but how to get back up every day and live knowing that every day that we wake up to news that there is someone else sitting in my shoes who's also being affected by the loss of a loved one due to gun violence. So thank you for the initiative in the beginning of making some gun changes. Thank you.
Ms. Turner, you have the love, the support, and hopefully some small bit of encouragement on behalf of this entire council and the community that wants to respond and will continue to support. Are there any comments from my colleagues? Thank you. The next speaker to come before council is Constance Gary. Is Constance here? Please let the record reflect that we read the name of Constance Gary. The next speaker to come, actually our final speaker to come before council is Mr. Andrew Pierce. Mr. Pierce, welcome to council. You have 3 minutes to speak. If you would give us your name, your address, and any organization that you may represent.
So my name is Andrew Pierce. I live at 561 Woodsfield Drive, and would first like to thank you for inviting, I represent the Student Leadership Organizing Committee over at Columbus Alternative High School, as well as Julia. I'd like to first thank you all for inviting me and Columbus Alternative to an important conversation. I come here today to represent the students of not only COS, but also CCS in general. At my school, various students are concerned and worried if there is going to be sustainable and true change brought about. I want to tell you all that the students are watching those in elected office and are prepared to ask the tough questions. For example, the students of COS are past protesting and past demonstrating what we believe needs to happen. For example, instead of walking out this last Friday like many of our peers on the national level, we instead had a town hall within our school to discuss gun legislation with local community members and law enforcement officers. Because we believe that this discussion can not only happen between city officials, it has to be a community effort with all stakeholders, like my colleague, Ms. Alwyn, stated. I do ask that when city council members and city officials consider these 4 ordinances and enforce them through Columbus Police Department, that each community in Columbus is treated fairly and justly. I say this due to the fact that many times in our history, the Columbus Police Department has unjustly discriminated against people of color and marginalized communities over imitation weapons, most notably the cases of Henry Green and Tyree King. With reference to Ordinance 2323.53 and imitation firearms, I ask that when this is introduced, that Columbus police officers receive proper training on how to identify imitation firearms and how to handle a situation peacefully and not ending with a young man of color being shot, as our previous instances have stated. With instances to ordinances considering illegal firearms, I state that these ordinances not only target the citizen violating the ordinance, but also the seller, like my community member also stated. With it inference to the Linden community, I know that there are no gun stores in Linden. But there are various citizens in Linden that do have guns. So I ask that when officers take away a citizen's gun, I ask that you find out where that gun comes from as part of the forfeiture clause. With all these gun-related ordinances, I stress the importance that city officials don't only address the violator of the ordinances, but ask how the citizen was able to violate the ordinance. I ask that all of you not only prosecute the reaction to the problem, but prosecute the root of the problem. Again, I thank you for listening to me and the students of the city, and look forward to the change we elected you to make.
Thank you, Mr. Pierce. Thank you for your testimony. I would say, especially to the imitation component of this legislation, if passed by this council, training for our officers, of course. I think Assistant Director spoke to that. But it's also going to be incumbent on us as a community to have a conversation. Once we pass the ban of sale of imitation guns, we're also going to have a conversation. And this is where young people might be able to be helpful, because we're going to have to talk to each other about how we use those guns. Because at the end of the day, I do want, when we talked about this legislation, I was thinking about young men that look like you and me. They come from communities, and how we can keep them safe. And that conversation goes both ways. And so I think that will be one where we'll have to link arms, and I'll maybe even have like a public campaign to how do we dissuade each other and our communities from thinking that some of those guns are toys. They are not. And they make our community safe, unsafe. So thank you so much for your comments. Are there any comments from my colleagues? Thank you so much, Ms. Pierce. Mr. Pierce's comments were the final comments in a very important conversation about how we keep neighborhoods safe. I think each and every speaker brought thoughtful commentary, thoughtful feedback that helps move our community forward. Are there any final comments first from City Attorney Klein or Solicitor General? Are there any final comments from my colleagues? Councilmember Brown.
First and foremost, President Hardin, and yourself and the mayor and city attorney, to tackle this issue is significant. And I think it's important for the community to be aware of the fact that it is not an easy task. If it was, it would have been done a lot sooner than it is tonight. But I would say to Mrs. Turner, who testified a little while ago, to please take a moment and maybe get a chance to talk to Dr. Roberts. There are programs that are available to help people learn how to address the issues of conflict resolution, what's good for you, how to teach you how to handle those circumstances and not refer to violence. So all of that is significant. But again, from my perspective, Council President, thank you very much for hosting this evening.
Councilman Marimi.
Thank you very much, Council President Hardin. I'd like to thank you for your leadership in working to bring this forward. City Attorney Zach Klein and the Mayor's office as well. I want to remind everybody that the conversation continues. We are very open to hearing feedback, and even though this hearing's over with this evening, we will be available to discuss these issues further, and we certainly welcome and really want your comments. This is just the beginning of our work to tackle specifically the holes between the state and the federal government and the gun laws. So appreciate everybody coming out this evening, and we look forward to the opportunity to continuing a robust dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Marimi. Again, I want to thank all the folks who stuck around for the conversation. I think it was worth the deep dive that we had at the beginning. It was worth the background that was given from our safety department. It was worth the understanding of the issues that are faced, folks in our community, especially women, are faced in terms of domestic violence, and certainly worth understanding the effects that it has, and understanding that it is really a traumatic and a health issue for our community. The public comments were, though, probably the most important and most impactful portion of this hearing. It allowed us to understand the real-life implications of the words, and as Solicitor General said one time, the legalese of what we do sometimes, that there are human lives at stake, and also differing opinions on how we continue to make our community safer. And I think that was articulated through the public feedback. Again, I want to thank Mayor Ginther for his leadership, City Attorney Klein and his entire office for really diving into this wholeheartedly. Every speaker that we had, Deputy Director Pashadi, Commissioner Dr. Mashika Roberts, Dr. Kessick, and Ms. Sue Valillo. I want to thank all of my colleagues, each one of my colleagues, and even my colleagues who aren't able to be here today, sifted through, asked the pre-questions, encouraged these hearings. I look forward to consulting with specifically probably Councilmember Brown to see if there's another hearing that we'll do around the safety. Like I said, these ordinances kind of cross over a couple different committees, and I want to make sure that there is space for additional comments and conversations if needed before we act or move on this legislation. But we don't want to talk forever, we will act. And so look forward to bringing legislation in a timely manner. I want to thank the CTV crew that films this and stays late to make sure that not just the folks in this room, but the folks throughout our community can be a part of this conversation. I want to thank Zach Davidson in my office, Ms. Joellen Klein, our city legal advisor, Mike Brown in our office for helping to shepherd this legislation. And in closing, we believe in a Columbus where everyone can feel safe, and we believe that this set of legislation, these set of ordinances are a continued step in that direction. Thank you all for being here, and have a good evening.